Director of the Wildlife Natural Resource Trust. We'll just start with introduction. Scott.
Good morning, everybody. Scott Smith, Deputy Director of Game and Fish.
Hi, I'm Shannon Regan. I'm with Sgit Consulting out of Denver and Saratoga.
I'm Pete Davidman. I'm with ICF out of Gillette.
Dave Bellis of the Basic Associations.
Lori Armstrong, I'm the Deputy State Director for Resources and Planning with BLM on day 1, 2 hours in.
So Lori, our apologies. Some of us have worked together, but give us a little bit more of your background. This Lori has replaced Buddy Green, who retired.
Right.
And so she's the new Deputy Director for Resources, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so just give us a...
Don't call me Buddy, but if you need to call me, I don't...
You were in Casper prior to this. And
so for 6 months between June and December, I was the acting district manager in Casper behind Stephanie Connolly. Stephanie Connolly actually took my old district manager position in Colorado. I was the district manager in the Southwest District for BLM there for 9 years. But after shifting from district manager in Colorado, I actually became the Rocky Mountain Region Sage Grouse Coordinator for about 3 years. So that's the job I'm technically coming from, but not really, because I'm really coming from the Pipelines and being the district manager there. So
thank you.
So a little familiar with Sage Grouse, but I forgot it in the last 6 months. So
We'll get you trained back up.
Paul Ulrich, Joint Energy. Brian Rutledge, National Audubon. John Espy, Carbon County Commissioner representing county government.
Doug Thompson, Ag.
Joe Blood, Wyoming Department of Ag.
Scott Gamo, why not?
Robert Hamilton, Rocky Mountain Power.
Heather McFerrin, Fish and Wildlife Service.
Susan Child, State Land Office.
Joe Scott, Oil and Gas Commission.
Brian Jensen, NRCS.
Good morning, U.S. Forest Service, Russ Bacon.
Joy Bannon, Wyoming Wildlife Federation.
Lyndon Bucher, American Colloid.
Megan?
Megan Lockwood, Game and Fish. Karen Rogers, Game and Fish.
Wayne?
Wayne Cotton, Game and Fish IT.
Samuel Jackson, Fish IT.
Jonathan?
Jonathan Medill, Biobank. Tyler Catro, Batman Performance Mineral. Michael Muller, BPM.
Jim Orford, Intermountain Resources.
Megan Dagenfelder, Southland Realty.
Missionaries, Associated Conservation.
Dave Applegate, Anadarko.
Michael Madrid, BLM, Cheyenne.
Jason Crowder, State Land Office.
Jack Eastrom, DP.
Mark Conrad, Game and Fish.
Allie Little, Black Hills Energy.
Nicholas Graff, University of Wyoming, Wages.
Eric Moody, Tri-Hydro. Michael Lindsley, EOG.
Spencer Kimball, also EOG.
Matt Fuller, SWCA, Environmental Consultant.
Good morning, Sandy Underhill, Forest Service.
Tom?
Tom Christensen, Sage Grouse.
Sage Grouse, Game and Fish.
Wayne Spencer, BLM.
Jenny Marswick, BLM.
Darren Long, BLM.
Linda Cope, Game and Fish.
Matt Holler, Sage Grouse.
Leslie Schreiber, Game and Fish.
Okay, thank you all. Oh, Beth, did you sneak in?
I did,
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that. Beth Calloway, Governor Gordon's office.
All right, that everybody? No? Holly?
Holly Kennedy, Wyoming Farm Bureau.
All right, welcome. We'll just jump right into this. I think the agenda, I don't have any plans to change it. However, I know there are several people who said that they really want to hopefully not be here till the end of the day, so we will move through it and we'll make a decision at lunchtime whether we're going to move ahead to see kind of where we are. I'm not going to rush it, but I don't think that we need to prolong it either. So with that, Russ, do you want to start with where you guys are on planning, you and Beth, maybe?
Sure. So comment period for the DEIS ended January 3rd. We have made a decision not to extend that because all the systems were operational, even though most of us were not working. So the comment intake process worked just fine. We ended up with 33,000 comments through that process, of which about 600 were unique. So working hard on an executive summary on those comments that we received and on track for probably a mid-April release of the FEIS and draft record of decision. So full speed ahead on the process, and I'm feeling good on the timeline. That's the short and sweet of it. Any questions?
Just relate the timeline, please.
Pardon?
Again, relate the timeline.
So we are working on the executive summary of comments right now. The draft record of decision and final EIS are expected to be out in mid-April. So that then is a 60-day objection period for that, and then so we're looking at somewhere between July and September for a final decision. July to September, depending on the complexity of objections, etc.
So Beth, do you want to kind of update on what we've done with the cooperator meetings, where we are? I mean, the short version is we've had tremendous dialogue back and forth, and I think that there's a real commonality. We've been able to use the comments from all of you, and Beth has been the one who's done a yeoman's job of pulling all that together and keeping things going. So why don't you give an update from the governor's side?
Yeah.
Kind of where we're at.
So, as Bob mentioned, the governor's office and cooperators met multiple times throughout the comment period to go through the proposed language and identify potential areas for clarification and for additional alignment with the state's strategy. So, the letter that the governor's office, Governor Mead's office, submitted included a pretty detailed table of these suggested changes. And this was not without, a lot of dialogue with the Forest Service. I think the running theme here would be it's always good to have conversations to get on the same page about what the intent is behind language and where opportunities are for that alignment. So we submitted those comments in time on the deadline, and we're prepared to continue a dialogue moving forward.
Any questions for either Beth or Russ? I don't think, as with the previous, certainly it's fair to say that they had a leg up because they got to watch the BLM process, and we all kind of had an idea of where things were going, but I don't think there was anything really where we had any major disagreement. Things came together fairly well, and I think it's very consistent with what we've done in the state of Wyoming, so that's good news. This is really devious now. Lori, would you like to give the BLM update, or would you like to have somebody else help with that?
Jenny?
So we are in protest resolution and governor's consistency review phase. The protest period ended on January 28th. It had got extended because we made some, we updated an appendix that had slipped, and made changes so that it was correct with the management actions that we had changed in the fine. So our protest period was extended to accommodate that. And then our protest period was also extended by a day because e-planning was down for a day while we were all out. I think that's it for the updates. We're heading into the...
And Mike McGrady kind of took the lead on the BLM side. Mike's now the Deputy Director of the Attorney General's Office for Torts, so Beth and I are picking that up where we left off. We were involved in it anyway, but the one thing I would say, and I think most of you, some of you have asked for it, and I've sent it to you, obviously it's public information, for the governor's consistency review letter. I can tell you that it was 3 pages long, and that included all the plaudits and how the heck are you in there and everything else. It was fairly direct, fairly minor things that got left out or that we didn't see as we went through that process. If anybody, I've got it with me if anybody wants a refresher on it, but I don't think there was anything in there that was particularly surprising. There were little things where a sentence got inserted, and I want to make clear, because we did, as we got to the 11th hour, Mike and I were on the phone with DC, and there were things that the wrong appendix, as Jenny mentioned, got put in. That didn't happen. That was the contractor error. That was not Washington doing something to Cheyenne, Cheyenne doing something to Washington. It was pure and simple, the contractor put the wrong appendix back in. We caught that. They were really good about going in and fixing that, pulling it out. But there were relics here and there of language. In fact, in the consistency review, Brian, I know you looked at it, I think 3 of the 5 items were all the same sentence in 3 different pieces of the appendix. So really minor stuff. The other thing I would tell you is I met with each of the groups back, is that a year ago? Individually, and we went through what the state had issues with in the amendment. None of that changed in that process. The same 7 items that we identified a year ago are the same 7 items that we focused in on. So I don't think there are any surprises. There will be some areas where some people, obviously from different backgrounds, are going to have a bit of disagreement, or they may want one way and the others want it a little different. Obviously, that's where the policy side comes in, and we've tried to accommodate everybody the best we can and maintain what we do in Wyoming. So that's where we are relative to the federal plan updates. Do people have questions?
Just a timeline on that for rods and servers.
Timeline, we're
Early March. Early March?
well, and I'm expecting, Jenny, that the response to the protest consistency review probably in the next couple of weeks, and the rod
So, yeah,
rod mid-March. Is that?
yeah, that's why I gave you the questioning,
Yeah.
not timeline.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? Thoughts?
I might just add real quick, so some folks might wonder about the timeline between Governor Meade and Governor Gordon's administrations and the commenting on the consistency review, but you know, after review of what was submitted under Governor Meade's administration, Governor Gordon didn't decide to follow up with any comment letter or anything like that. So the comments from Meade's administration carried forward.
And that's a good segue into the next topic. We've had numerous conversations with Governor Gordon about what direction he would like to take relative to sage grouse, and there are several balls that are kind of in the air, if you will. Beth mentioned the first one. I think none of us felt like it was very necessary for Governor Gordon to come in, write the same letter, or do something else. He did meet with Interior and met with the Secretary and the deputies back there 2 weeks ago. Went over the issues that we were trying to resolve, so he's very well aware of those, up to speed of where we are. At this point in time, and this isn't set in stone, but these are the recommendations, and at least to date, I think he has indicated not a willingness, but actually a desire to sign an EO in his administration so that it eliminates any confusion that we're operating under one governor's EO and you have a new governor. It's the same process we went through when Governor Friedenthal left office and Governor Meade came in, albeit a much contracted, because Governor Gordon has been involved in this process and has a little bit more background than Governor Meade did at the time. Right now, with the legislature on, we're not talking sage grouse at all, unless we're forced to do so by Heather or somebody else. And she hasn't been too bad on us. But at the end of the session, we'll probably start into the process of looking at a Governor Gordon executive order. The timeline for that we've laid out that I think you can anticipate is that we're going to ask you for any comments that you have, and they can be general. You know, we need to update this particular section. They can be specific. These words are wrong. We're not looking at dissecting this thing and changing it very much, but there are some areas where we have new information. There are areas where we are citing things that are outdated or have been updated. There are areas that are perhaps not relevant today that were relevant in 2008 that we can take a look at. We'd like to take a fairly thorough look at what the EO now says. Let me give you an example. The EO now, if you look at the mitigation piece, It just says we will develop a mitigation strategy. Well, we've done that. That probably needs to go into the Gordon executive. Those are the kind of things we're asking all of you, and that includes the public, and we will get this out through the website that it's open for comment. We'd like those by April. And not April 30th. Probably mid-April, we'd like to have those in. That will allow the governor's staff and everybody a chance to discuss it at the April Sgit meeting, and then make recommendations to Governor Gordon. And I would anticipate a new executive order, probably not before June or July. We're not in a hurry, but I think it'll take a couple months after that to sit down, walk through it, get the Attorney General to review it, and make sure that it's what Governor Gordon is comfortable with. Beth, you got anything to add to that?
No, I think that covers it.
Angie,
No, we can post that on our website, so you can have one place to see that request, yeah.
Okay, questions, thoughts? Yeah, Doug.
What's the status of this group?
This group is statutory, and so it exists. There is a review that the legislature is going to do, and I did go in and talk to the Rules Committee in the Senate about that. They're questioning a lot of select committees, a lot of their participation in other groups like this. This is one that they may take the legislative reps off of, but other than that, the makeup of this group is a statutory, and it stays the same. There are, half of you are up for appointment this time. Some of that is a ritualistic, you know, Fish and Wildlife, it just is a slot for Fish and Wildlife, so that's kind of one that they determine, and, you know, unless it's just an egregious foul. The others, my recommendation to the governor has been that for those who wanted to stay on, which I believe was all of them, that they be reappointed. So I think that recommendation's already been made, and that's where it sits.
Except for you, Doug.
Yeah, we're going to have you serve as an oil and gas representative now, and Paul is going to do county government.
That is.
I know he's going to move over to the environmental side. No.
I was on that because they had Sage Grouse on that governor's appointment process thing.
Yeah, technically it is an appointment and it has to be done. And what we did when they did it statutorily, because there are two from most groups of the public, we just put each of them their 4-year terms, and we just flipped a coin and said, okay, Brian, you got a 4 and Joy got a 2, and then as that reappointment goes forward, you'll have them rotating each time. So Paul's is up this time, for instance. I think yours is the one that's up. I think Brian, yours is up. And I'd have to look and see who the others are. Some of them, like county government, where there's only one, that just fell in where we just kind of one and then the other. Other questions about where we're going? Yeah.
Just to be real clear, what you're looking for is edits of the existing executive order prior to preparing a draft new executive order.
Yeah, and Brian, I think I'm trying not to underdo this, but really what I think we're looking for more than edits is areas that need to really have a hard look at them. I mean, you can go in and change a may to a shall or all that. That's not really that's what the governor will do. But are there areas in the executive order today that are outdated? Are there areas where we know more and we need to update them? Are there things in there that we forgot? Are there things that no longer have relevance? Really, the big rocks is kind of more what we're looking for now.
I guess when I say edits, what I'm saying is you're looking for the base document to be the existing EO, and that we are working from the existing EO. You're not going to issue a draft.
No.
That we're then going to comment on.
The draft is the existing.
That's
a good guess. Well put. Okay. Other questions on that? General questions for the governor? Yeah, Tom?
Does that include the map or just the 7-year?
No, the map's off the table at this point. Thank you for that. You know, we just updated that. I don't, there's no, as the order says, compelling and new information that we're aware of that would lead to a change in version 4, so. Other questions?
Bob, it's more of just a comment. I mean, we're just gonna have to, timing is a challenge for us as we think about where we're at in the amendment process. Just gonna have to work closely on that to make sure we're synchronized. One of the hazards and benefits of trying to align with 5 different states is trying to get all 5 states to hold still for long enough for us to align. And so it's just, we're just gonna have to communicate a lot.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason for not getting into this headlong, certainly when I talked with the governor, is that will actually allow us to have the BLM RMP amendments done, yours at a stage where they're very near done before the executive order is redone. That probably adds to consistency. I hear what you're saying. Utah just came out with a new plan right in the middle of the planning process. That's a little hard to deal with, and frankly, we did this in 2015 when Governor Meade reissued his order, and we were in the middle of the process too. So I think this one actually will lay out a little more logically because you will be through that federal planning process more. Hopefully that's the case. Beth, anything you want to add on that, or any?
Bob?
Yes.
Like in the past, are you going to be expecting a response from the Fish and Wildlife Service on the new EO once it's issued?
Certainly a review, Heather. I don't know that we're gonna, that water's kind of flowed under the bridge, I think, as far as the official response. You're a part of the team. As with everything, we will want a review from you, but I don't know that the governor's gonna want to go out in a formal fashion and ask for that. I think that remains to be seen.
On
yeah.
the compensatory mitigation, is that finalized? You said that it's going to be a part of this potentially?
The framework we have is what we're using. If there are things there, and we're obviously taking a hard look at that as far as the term of the credit base, that will continue on. But as far as the framework itself, yes, I think that will be incorporated into the new executive. Deemer, welcome. You want to introduce yourself?
If I said no,
I'll do it for you.
acceptable answer.
I'll do it for you. And
I'm Deemer True, and I represent PAW, and I need a cup of coffee.
Okay, thank you. Other questions, concerns, thoughts? So we'll get a notice out probably after this meeting, just a reminder to all the members, and then we'll post it on the website that we are accepting comments, and we'll kind of hone that down, Angie and Karen, to where it focuses in on the big rocks and not necessarily line by line editing. I think if there's something, an egregious error or something that you want to identify, please do it. But beyond that, really, this is the governor's to edit and to write the way he wants it, and I think that's what you'll see. So. Okay. Oh, we're supposed to have lunch. Waivers, exceptions, modifications. Angie, Dwayne.
Sure, I'll kick it off and Dwayne is gonna add in. So at the last Sgit meeting, if you guys remember, we were charged with a subcommittee. And the goal of that was to review BLM's processes with waivers, exceptions, and modifications, and how those would work for a proponent who is seeking an exception with the Sage Grouse executive order. So basically to look at the two processes and see how they align. So we have met once before the shutdown, and we talked through those different options and processes and what they meant. And really where we landed is we still felt that exceptions was the avenue for most proponents to use for the BLM process, but where we really were struggling a little bit is The process is really aligned when we were talking about what we ended up defining as little e exceptions. So maybe just a modification to the seasonal timing steps, like a 2-week waiver. So kind of those one-off exceptions, the process is pretty much in line. But where we were struggling a little bit is where you've heard the Game and Fish talk at various meetings about wanting to see the whole picture of development, so like a development plan, either a 2-year plan, a 5-year plan, not just say with oil and gas, a well pad for well pad look at things. So when we ask for that and we ask for this bigger plan, that type of a review doesn't necessarily fit as well into the BLM's current process. And so that's where we decided that we needed to dig deeper and make sure those two aligned. And so we set up another meeting, which got postponed. So that's kind of where we are, is to start again and to dig a little deeper into looking at those more comprehensive plans when proponents may want an exception and how that fits with the executive order. So I'm going to turn over to Dwayne. Paul was there, Esther, if you guys have any comments.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to have Dave and Esther kind of go through a little bit of the issues that they raised. Yep. I think for the whole group, this is an opportune time to talk about this elephant in the room and the difficulties that we run into. But Dwayne, do you have anything before that?
No, Angie and I got together, she's covered what we did in the meeting there.
Okay, Dave, you gave a pretty good overview of some of these issues at that first meeting. Do you want to talk a little bit about the challenges that you guys are trying to deal with?
I'm not really prepared, but I'll try to throw out a couple comments. We did bring an example that showed sort of how—
Stand up, would you please?
We brought an example to the meeting that kind of showed how development is occurring, say in Commerce County, with multi-well pads and long laterals, how that development might occur in the township, and how if there was overlapping LECs, we would know maybe at the EA level, we would be able to lay out how that would develop and how there would be the need to have a full season timing step for a multi-well pad that would be in that type of situation. So I think we were just trying to explain how development has changed, how on location is much longer than it might have been, say, in CDM play or even other plays around the state. And that one, those very early on at the point of permit application, that one is going to have this conflict arise. So I felt like we had a really good meeting and kind of talking through an example and just sort of laying out the reason that we have the potential need for timing scheduling in those types of situations. I don't know, Esther, do you want anything else to that, Bob?
Well, yeah, I think it sounds simple, but you get into what rules apply is really the problematic part. We've asked and asked industry, and it's not just oil and gas, it's highways, it's everything, to plan ahead, look comprehensively at what their development scenario looks like. We've had companies come in and lay their confidential information on the table and say, this is what we think we're gonna do in the next 5 years. And that has been incredibly helpful to have an ability then to say, well, can you move this one here? Can you drill in this order? Can you avoid and minimize first and have the least amount of impact? And right now, in some cases, if that happens, and you guys jump in if I'm wrong, it doesn't fit the exception process. It fits a different process, which triggers a different set of legal compliances and everything. And so we're not really facilitating good planning and responsible development. We're actually facilitating, oops, I dropped the tool in the hole and now I need more time. That's counter to what we're trying to do. And I think what Dave did is laid out a development scenario, and Jack's done the same thing with this, and said, this is what it would look like. This is where we think we would need an exception. And then you can sit down and talk specifically about one impact on a group of birds or on a piece of habitat. And we've been able, as a result, to really reduce the amount of impact that's out there on the ground, radically reduce that. So that's the challenge we have, And I think that we're still trying to get to where, how do we skin that cat? Other thoughts, anybody wanna add anything? Jack, I mean, you dealt with this too, you got anything you wanna add?
I don't think so, other than what Dave added. Obviously, you know, we're not under development right now because we're up for divestment, but I think that's the biggest thing is laying out your plan. But probably Dave shared our biggest, a lot of things change are so fluid. I mean, here's what we want to do now, but then we might change engineers or something, and then they come in and see it a different way. Well, we want to look at the Fox Hill formation. So I mean, it's just kind of hard. What you give today may not always be for next week. I mean, we can have a good plan, but it's just sometimes it's hard to execute internally with changes, you know, maybe the type of rig you're using, companies, contractors, is sometimes it's just, things are always changing. It's just kind of sometimes hard to just stay flat and keep with your plan.
But just one other thing I wanted to add is, you know, we're trying to demonstrate the industry has had really significant technological changes in the last decade. And some of these laterals are now, you know, 2 mile long laterals. But you still have sort of constraints because of the way oil and gas is spaced on where you have some flexibility on where you put a pad. If you have much fewer pads, it's not like Sgit where you might have had 8 pads per section. But where that large pad goes has some below ground constraints. And so we're trying to balance the fact that, look, this technology is really reducing the amount of fragmentation and disturbance, but we have maybe limitations. Maybe it's at the top of the drilling and spacing unit or the bottom of the drilling and spacing unit, but there are limitations on how one can move that large pad and reach all of the target zones. So again, I feel like it was a really good sort of educational for us too, so we want to understand this process and then outline again what our development constraints are.
Yeah, it comes down to you've got Angie and her shop doing their job, which is looking at the surface, the company doing their job, which is accessing the subsurface, and if they're not talking, things that look simple to the engineer going below ground may be catastrophic above and vice versa. And that's where we've got to figure out how the process can accommodate that. And it's both ends, so.
Plus, you know, while looking at your collision issue below ground.
Right.
You know, in that, like if you're gonna drill toe up, toe down, you know, if we're gonna go north line, where we've done is, you know, drilling federal from private, you know, feed from federal, and I think it's helped us, you know, really reduce the footprint, but again, it's just, there's a lot of things to consider, you know, what's good for us, and all of a sudden you go, well, that's not so good for me.
Paul?
I'll echo, if there's one constant in the industry, it's our drilling schedule will change. If we can continue to move forward with incentivizing prior planning that includes avoidance and minimization, you know, and some appropriate timing step relief if needed. Given the fact that in a lot of these areas we can continually lessen our overall impact, you know, by some timing step relief, I think that's going to go a long way in helping, I don't know, break down that disruption, you know, with that seasonal step in place. You know, if we've got a location where we've got 6 or 8 or 10 or even more wells on it, and we're able to be on that location for longer, what that's going to do is allow us to reduce having to add 3 or 4 more locations, you know, and the habitat loss associated with those locations, you know, in the summer, to be honest. So I think if we can continue to push towards ways where we can incentivize, you know, with that relief in place, it's gonna help a lot. I can assure you that.
Other thoughts? Yeah, Joy.
So I think it is a positive step to have pre-planning, obviously, and be able to reduce fragmentation. Will the subgroup be looking at, you know, the timing stipulations are there for a reason. When we have a lot of oil and gas leasing, for example, happening throughout the state of Wyoming, and if we have a lot of pre-planning coming through, that we are able to look at developments where we can reduce the fragmentation, and maybe an exception, maybe little e, big E exceptions are made because of that due diligence on the part of the operator or operators. Is the subgroup going to be looking at like how many they're given in a certain landscape? So like a core area is not going to be inhibited negatively or impacted negatively to a large degree.
So it doesn't change what the core area, the 5%, the 1 per 640. I mean, it may allow for an exception, but Angie, I think it'd be, we did this at the last meeting, I think, but I think this may be a good point for you and Linda, Mark, whoever, to talk a little bit about the analysis that you do when you get an exception request, because it hits on all of the things Joy raised. But do you want to just, or Linda, do you?
Yeah, I can talk about it. So when an exception request comes in, we review it, we send it out to our local biologist to review too, and we kind of take all of the factors that they're seeing out in the field, that the operator has involved with why they need that exception request before we send it out to the large group to review. I do see the need, and we have a lot of operators who are doing it, who do provide us with a plan of development, so that when I get an exception request in, knowing that that operator was in a better area for an exception request earlier in the season, but now maybe they're in an area that's going to be a little bit more impactful for an exception request, we could have worked that out with them maybe ahead of time with their schedule, hopefully, if they would have come to us earlier in the game. But we work through all of that. We review it within our shop, and then we will send it out to our federal partners and our state permitting agencies on that exception request for any feedback back as to what's happening out there. Now, when an exception request does come in, whether it's in core or not core, we're still asking the operators to minimize their impacts as much as possible, because they are in a sensitive area, and so they should be minimizing it. It's not just an exception request, go in and do whatever you need to do. And the operators have been good about carpooling people in, stockpiling sand ahead of time, so they're not going to have as much truck traffic. Following the noise tips if they can, for that traffic. Now with fracking, they can't do that, but with their traffic, perhaps they can. And scheduling their shifts so that they're trying to reduce their impacts to grouse out in those areas when we get those exception requests. Did that answer your question? Did that help?
I mean, that describes the process of what you go through. I guess it would just be, I think, important to know if on kind of a landscape scale, like how many exceptions or how much disturbance is being calculated or allowed in an area where, like, okay, I have a development here and development here and development up here, and they're all getting exceptions. Like, that's gonna ultimately be harmful to the bird over time. And so looking at that, making sure that that information is known. Are we allowing for too many exceptions? What is that threshold? And being able to monitor those things.
So maybe the better answer to that is that we've done half a dozen exceptions in the past year, the vast majority of which are timing exceptions, and the vast majority of which are in non-core. So there's the reality of it is that you've already avoided and minimized to get out of core. You're within the 2 miles. You are behind a hill where there's noise screening or whatever. All of those go into the steps that are taken to analyze each exception request. So the disturbance piece, how much disturbance have you actually even looked at? It's pretty minimal, isn't it?
Well, I think for on a seasonal step, the disturbance is usually already there. The ones that I've done, they're just kind of gonna leak into the seasonal stip, and they would like an exception because they're not, I had an operator come to us who wasn't quite sure they could get done in time. So they wanted to dot all their I's and cross all their T's before they, so they didn't, come in the back end asking for an exception request. For disturbance, we have had a few of them out there, but not a lot, and I don't know if we've added up those numbers of acres, I guess.
Yeah.
A lot of times the ones who are coming in over the 5% have a valid and existing right to go in there. So.
And that's where the concern starts to build is, we are having additional leasing, they're having a valid existing right, so on and so forth. So it's the build that I get.
Well, now be careful, because if you lease it today, it's not the same as a 208 valid existing right that Linda's talking about. Those are stipped.
Okay.
You have all of those stipulations that you agreed to meet when you lease it today. So they're not the same thing. The other thing that may help, Brian, I know you want to comment. I think and Dave and I had a little go around over this at the last meeting. If they come in and the EIS says we're gonna drill up to 5,000 wells, the immediate thing that happens with the public is they convert 5,000 wells to 5,000 vertical deep gas well pads. Well, 5,000 wells is actually an upper limit with 10 per pad. So it's 500 potential well pads. And then the reality in Wyoming is that half of those never get drilled. So you're down to 250. And then you look at the ones that are in violation of the executive order, particularly in non-core, we're talking, a handful of potential exceptions. But the industry has done this, and BLM, and it is transparency. Yeah, there's 5,000 wells. But what does the footprint of those 5,000 wells look like? And nobody ever talks about that. And that's really important for this group to be on top of, because it's not 5,000, it's not Mad Max, for God's sakes. That's the vision people have. Go ahead, Brian.
Well, I think they have every right to the vision until we do a better job of educating them otherwise.
I agree.
The fact is, this takes me to a different place, and that is the discussion of doing an annual report, of getting these stats out there. Because we've set some timetables and we've slipped past them. The Daniel look, I think, was very important, but I think that we have to get on to where we're looking at all of our core areas. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time today on my concerns about the overall plans because of the other states, et cetera. But the fact is, we have to be able to establish what we are or are not achieving with what we're doing here. The most frequently repeated statistic I've been able to give is one from several years ago, where we reduced vertical drilling, conventional drilling, by 64% in a 2-year period, and increased directional drilling by over 1,500%. And if we're able to relate those things, Scott and I have now presented the matrix on planning to the 11 states to WAFA 3 times. Of course, now we have a completely altered audience. The leadership is basically gone from WAFA with the last round of elections. So we're going to be, to some extent, starting over again. But I really want Wyoming to be there on being able to prove what we have or have not done.
Well, I think Karen, Angie, we have that, don't we?
Yeah, and I think what Brian's referring to is there has been delays with the Fish and Wildlife component and then building that in. Nicholas, please correct me if I'm wrong. So, the new application should be ready soon because we're building all that in to do exactly what Brian just said. Is to be able to do annual reports or even more frequently if we need to tell the story like Joy mentioned and look at each core area or look at the state as a whole to be able to evaluate the disturbance, but also the restoration and the good conservation efforts as well. So it tells the complete story.
Well, I think we're talking kind of in 2 different things, though. I think one is that right now today, Angie can tell you how many exceptions have been asked for, granted, and what the pertinent disturbance is. We give you that date that quick. That's one thing. The other that I think, Brian, that you're looking at is the cumulative what's going on independent of exceptions. And that would be an activity that complies with the executive order. How many of those are out there? And that one rolled up with all of the restoration and other work is the one that's been delayed. But what I thought I heard you asking for was, and Joy, maybe I was listening more to Joy, is can you tell me today how many exceptions have been asked for?
That should be part of that. What I'm getting at is that should be part of the same report. And it's not just at this table. You know, we're gonna face some serious challenges in the upcoming months from legal suits. There's just no two ways about it. And so to be able to establish clearly what we are achieving, clearly that the exceptions are not donuts that are passed out at the beginning of every meeting. You know, that's the impression that's out there. It's like you were talking about 5,000 wells being in the forecast becomes, you know, 5,000 wells in reality. We have to be able to relate it in a digestible fashion to the consumer, because otherwise it's just so much talk from us, in my opinion.
And where are we, Karen? We can do that, can't we?
I want to make a quick comment on the whole permitted versus realized. The other thing that would go into this reporting that I want everybody to keep in mind is just because somebody got an exception doesn't mean they used it.
Correct.
And so, particularly with over 5% compensatory mitigation, any compensatory mitigation situation, many of those companies are doing that sometimes they do it as a contingency because they aren't confident they can avoid it, but if they can, they will. So a lot of them go unrealized. I've had several approved requests that never get.
I really think that's important, and I think that in addition to that is the whole as-built discussion. Because just because it was permitted doesn't mean it was built either.
Correct.
And so if we're not doing as much damage as it would appear from the permitting, you guys industry are cheating yourselves if you leave it on the table, because it becomes part of disturbance de facto.
And that's part of that DDCT component with the as-built. I think that is really critical in, you know, being able to analyze how much density disturbance has been done.
And that, Nicholas, we got that. I mean, that is an actual calculation from the photo that shows where the disturbance is, and it's updated every time there's an activity. So, no, we don't.
Well, the as-built is the.
We just talked about that in that training. As soon as Nicholas's shop passes their recommendation on to the permitting agency, it's considered disturbed.
Correct.
But then going back and saying, actually, we didn't disturb all of this, we just disturbed like 20% or 40%, and then so that is getting updated later on, so like post-development.
Correct.
So that's the piece that I think is also very critical in making sure that it gets accomplished and then calculated.
Are we not doing that, Nicholas?
We have not gotten a lot of voluntary participate in as-built, so that's an area we need to step up our game. But we, you know, where we have gotten it, we have updated it. But
I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that as you do the next one, if there's an as-built out there that was 50% of what it was proposed to be, the new analysis will incorporate the actual, not the previous.
Correct.
It depends if it's still approved. So,
or if it's done, I guess.
So,
yeah.
So if somebody does a DDCT and they have 20 well pads on it, and they maintain those permits, that disturbance is maintained for the purposes of calculation. Correct. However, Nicholas, we haven't worked out enough so that Nicholas can determine whether, if there's a well spot on the pad, one can assume that disturbance, whether it was 5 acres or 7 acres, that might be a question, but we can sort of have rough which ones are actually built and which ones aren't. And then there's certainly some refinement and improvement to be made there, but for the purposes of calculation, if somebody maintains those permits, those disturbances are carried forward for the purposes of calculation.
I think it's fair to say that on both sides, what we are doing, we are overestimating the amount of disturbance that is actually out there, which should be an incentive to industry to participate in the as-built and say, this is actually what we did. It should also be heartening for the conservation side to realize that there's more disturbance on the layer, thus you're not even approaching 5% because you're overcounting what's actually happening out there. That's not a bad problem to have. If it were the reverse, it'd be a huge problem. So I think as we move, I guess my understanding, and I may need to get back with Nicholas and Karen, is that as you move forward, what is actually that footprint on the ground is what's analyzed the next time a DDCT is run. So we're constantly updating that layer. And yeah.
Yeah, that layer, I mean, that layer is very dynamic as it is now. We need to be better about making it even more dynamic, especially taking stuff off.
Right.
Yeah, and that's something we definitely need to, improve with this GBC 2.0, is incorporating as-built and requesting those.
Bob, we had a discussion in the prior meeting. When we did this, we took all the federal units and just cut them out.
Correct.
And now we're hearing about federal units that aren't being developed.
Have never been developed.
Never have been developed. Putting those back on the table, if feasible, and I'm not trying to take away federal units, I'm just saying where they're not going to be developed, to put them back into the equation of what's core,
right,
is to the advantage of both conservation effort and development effort, because it changes the equation. We cut some big blocks out, and if they're not being developed and they are habitat, we're cheating ourselves.
So if you'll recall, I think it was 4 years ago, we had this same exact conversation, and that led OGCC and the feds and the industry to go look, and they dissolved some big units west of Casper, some old giant units northeast of Thermopolis. So a lot of that layer came off, but I think there are still many out there that could be analyzed, and there's all kinds of, there's property rights, prior rights, a lot of things out there. But the one I remember the best was Copper Mountain, I think, out of Thermopolis, where they drilled 5 or 10 dry holes and nobody was interested in anything, and the company that had unitized it was long gone, and they were kind of like, why are we doing this? So you're right, and I think that those are...
Well, my interest is getting it all on the table, so the public feels part of it. We know what we're talking about. We're not continuously, I feel like I'm selling snake oil sometimes when I'm giving several-year-old information.
Just oil, not snake.
To defend us. You look around and the other states are nowhere near as prepared as we are. They're in for serious challenges, and those spill over onto us. So the more we can do with getting our game together, it gives Scott and I an advantage when we go to these other states to get, hey, this is sort of a simplified way for you to look at what Wyoming's doing and to get on board. Because otherwise, we're all in trouble.
Right. Other thoughts? Yeah, Doug.
Quick, since I'm the new oil and gas guy, I just have a question here.
You're snake oil and gas guy.
No, he's snake oil. Is there a downside, maybe Paul can, of, okay, these units, getting them back on the table? Okay, we're gonna take them away. Is there a downside of taking them away because they were put in place so that they could be developed? If you give that up, aren't you gonna have to go back through the whole process again?
Yeah, I mean, that would be up to the operator, right, to like decide whether or not they wanted to dissolve that unit.
Yeah,
it's a good question, and I think it's why we have this group, is that Deemer and Paul can tell you what kind of decisions lead to maintaining a unit with one well of holding production or whatever. You want to lay out some of the different scenarios where you would or wouldn't dissolve?
Well, if we're talking about a relatively newly formed unit, we certainly have obligations based on that federal unit language to develop that, and you'll have X amount of well count per year that you have to develop depending on when that unit came into formation. So that's for the relatively newer federal units where you've got to establish either a Yates well or a Payne well in an X amount of time, and then there's some pretty basic reasons to keep those federal units intact. Yeah. There's very reasonably foreseeable development. That's the reason you form the unit. In order to make sure that unit doesn't contract, you've got a number of things that you need to do to ensure that. And sometimes they even do, depending on the participating area. If somebody is clearly not have reached those thresholds 20 years ago, 30 years ago, where the rules were significantly different. And they want to put that back in, and there's an incentive for them to do it. That's something we need to look at, absolutely. I just don't know of any operators that would be willing to do that if they're currently looking at development in that particular federal unit. Now, if they're not, and they haven't, where the operator's long gone, that's a completely different scenario, and we should have a fairly robust running inventory of activity in those federal units that do have either part or are all in core, and that's not that difficult to do. BLM can run that.
Just provide a little clarification on that. So we've tried at least 3 or 4 times to come up and deal with this issue. For these are older units that did not have a provision required that they shrink down because of their age. And so trying to come up, a lot of them, obviously their core, they probably haven't had a lot of development in years and probably never will, but we couldn't come up with a methodology to say, oh, we're gonna only allocate you 50 acres, 80 acres, whatever we wanna come up with disturbance. But there is no requirement for them to shrink down and do that. We, BLM, we've tried and we did not succeed on that. That went to court and we lost that one. If you don't have that provision, you cannot require it. They can voluntarily come in and shrink it, but there is a methodology to look at the annual plan development. Most of these will probably never have any plan development go on. So there is a way of shrinking down, but they don't have any development plans, so they're not gonna spend the time trying to do it most of the time. There's just anything, there's nothing going on there. It's obviously core, so they haven't done much in years because it's got good habitat in it. So that's a struggle with it. You're right, Brian. If somebody wanted to come in to do something, they could look at it and say, wow, we've only had 7 wells out here. We've had a plan development for the last 40 years that hasn't had a single well developed here. It's probably a pretty low risk to take that out of the disturbed equation and do something with it. But
yeah, just to be clear, I wasn't proposing that we arbitrarily go around and do this. No, I'm saying industry put it back on the table.
Yeah. Well,
it's to your advantage.
But let's ask this question then, and I think Doug was getting to that, and Dwayne just described it. If you're going to tell somebody who has inherited a unit that was laid out there in the 60s, and you know they're running 8 stripper wells, and that's it, and that there's not going to be any more. Now you're asking them to go to the legal and planning and expense of coming in and dissolving a unit that isn't hurting them. We may need to be thinking, if we want to do this, about incentives to where that doesn't cost the company. They're on the hook to do the
to me, that's better mitigation than a lot of things we might come up with.
Very well may be.
Yeah. There's no reason why a prudent operator today would voluntarily dissolve an existing
I can't think of one reason to do it.
No reason whatsoever. Provide incentives and a reason for them to do it. If it meets X criteria, then we've got some.
Yeah. Would you be, Esther, would you be willing to work on that with your plans committee and ask what those incentives would look like? I think that, I mean, how many times have we run into this in this process in the last 12 years, where all of a sudden you're sitting there and going, well, why would they do that? Why would they spend whatever amount of money and time it is that is taking away from something else to do a good deed? I mean, there are lots of good deeds, but I think you're asking, I think it's an unreasonable ask. Will you do that? Thank you.
Hey Bob,
Yeah.
are we talking about areas that weren't designated as core, or these are units that were they're within core?
Units within.
And they're designated right now as disturbed areas?
100%. And that,
the
for
kicker
those
is, in those federal units, they're excluded from core area stipulations.
within.
Within.
But those, for a history lesson, for those who weren't here, huge debate early on about what to do with units, what to do with existing fields, Oregon Basin. We've heard that 1,000 times. We left them in because they existed and said, oh, all right, we're not going to have Swiss cheese and all these little pieces of Switzerland, as Mary used to say, and then recognize what they are. But the reality is that Oregon Basin is a very well-developed field that has a high level of disturbance versus the one I cited in Hot Springs County that had 4 dry hole well stems poked up, and that was it. And it was 40,000 to 50,000 acres. And did make sense. Okay, we're gonna give it to Esther. She's gonna educate us and tell us what we need to do to incentivize this. Okay, anything else on waivers, exceptions, modifications? Yeah, Matt?
Just to bring something up real quick, to kind of pull this back to where this discussion started with Dave and Joy, in terms of looking at the development plans and the real initiation of this conversation that quickly kind of went down a site-specific rabbit hole, if you will. Joy and Dave both bring up an exceptionally important point that has not been addressed, except within the kind of off-the-cuff way of looking at long-term development plans, and that is that there is not a metric within the SGEO that can be used to assess the health of a core area at the scale of that core area or across core areas, especially within development being pushed outside of core. I think that the discussion this morning with the DDCT made that abundantly clear. It's a very site-specific approach that's being developed, and we kind of have lost a little bit of that landscape approach with the amendments to the BLM plans. And I think Brian brings up we've been talking around it. So there is not really an approach within the SGO to address what Joy brought up. And that is the accumulation, that's the cumulative effects assessment associated with the exceptions, if you will, with the development, with the retiring of leases, whatever these site-specific components to the plan we just got through discussing. There's no way to quantify the effectiveness of all of these actions together.
Well, good point. The only thing I'll throw this back a little bit to Nicholas, Karen, and Angie. The whole reason we did the Daniel core area exercise was to see if we could do exactly what you're asking about. And I think that the answer was yes, we can do it, but you've got time and dollar constraints on how much we can get done. Do you want to address that a little bit, Angie? Because that group.
I'm not sure if I can. I wasn't a
Or
part of
Scott,
that group.
do you?
But
I mean, that's why we had the two subgroups, and that was one of their specific charges, and that's why we, Scott and I got together and said, let's go deep on one that we know that we can look at and say, okay, this, we know there's prescribed fire. We know you've got this. They built a golf course. We got these. Yeah. You want to?
Sure. And I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, we have a great person putting all this together, but he's a team of one plus whoever else he can recruit to help. And on the landscape, the Daniel Core exercise was a very small geographic area. You go next door to South Pass and all around the state, it's a huge time commitment. I don't doubt progress continues to be made. Excuse me.
Yeah, progress definitely is being made. The idea, with moving into this DECT 2.0 and incorporating a lot of these other tools, is to get this to be so it's not quite as labor intensive. Because we can collect a lot of this data and store it in the database so that we can generate those numbers a lot faster. Right now, it is a very labor intensive process, and so we're moving in I think the good and appropriate direction. We're just not quite there yet.
Would it be possible, in light of what Matt was asking, to do
before?
It sounds like I need some clarification. The problem is not necessarily the ground truthing and the accumulation of data within the database. The problem lies within the metrics that are being calculated from the data that is currently within the database. There is not to throw it off the top of my head, a fragmentation metric that's quantified at broader spatial scales within core areas. to look at how an exception here relates to an exception here. It's all done at the scale of a well pad and that 4 mile buffer around that well pad. And that negates the interplay between what happens at this 4 mile buffer and what happens at this 4 mile buffer up here. And it gets to the point of what Mary always tried to hammer home, is that we're setting ourselves up to Swiss cheese these core areas.
I think that is exactly what we tried to do with Daniel, was to look at all of the existing and potential disturbances and tie those together in the context of the core area. The question that I was gonna ask Nicholas is, how long would it take and what would it take to do that? We're gonna have to do it systematically. There's no way you can just say, do this for the entire state, 17 million acres. That isn't gonna happen. So are there areas that we wanna do that more, and what is the price tag for that? Because, you know, we've gotta figure out where that's gonna come from. And I think we have the data to do the analysis. We may not have done the analysis, Matt, the way that you described it, but that was the whole point of the Daniel core area exercise. And when we went through that, we were looking at prescribed burns and whether or not they had actually transitioned back. We were looking at, there was a guy built a little golf course down on Cottonwood, that came out, and that related to oil and gas activity down closer to the river, and that's the analysis that was done in that exercise. I think we have the capacity to, we have the ability to do it. Do we have the resources is the question. And I think, Nicholas, that would kind of land in your lap to give us an idea, what would that take? How long would that take?
I would have to get with.
Yeah, I'm not asking you to answer it today. Is that something that you guys would?
Yeah, it's something we can certainly look into. I think the hardest, so there's a couple of manual steps. So, we can talk about some of the harder roadblocks. I don't think that needs to necessarily be in this giant discussion, but it's certainly a discussion. I guess I have a question for Matt, though. You've kind of alluded to our Daniel example isn't what you're looking for, so I guess can you explain what metrics you're hoping for us to report on?
No.
I suggest that we have another meeting of this committee right away. And part of that is to decide what it does cost, because what I'm looking at is the cost of not doing it. You know, and I think we better be up on that.
Well, I'm 24 days into the legislature, so the cost of not doing it, they don't listen to that crap. And what we need to be is in a position to go back and say, look, if we do this right, it's gonna take this long, and this is what it's gonna cost, and figure out where that comes from.
Yeah, because the last time we talked, we were on a September time schedule, and I'm not talking the coming September. I'm talking about the past September. So we've got to get it figured out and get it booked if we're going to do it. And if we're not going to do it, we need to start talking about what the hell our fallback position is.
Right. John.
I get, from my point of view, I think we're trying to lump all the cores in, and where I think where we should be talking is, let's look at those cores where we've done the exceptions, or where we
have a concern.
Where we have a concern, and let's bring this down to something that's manageable, because we have a core area where nothing's going on. It's been the same way it's been for 50 years. I don't think we need to spend any money there. Let's try to come back and really focus in and pinpoint on these areas of disturbance, and how is that affecting those specific core areas or portions of those core areas.
I think that's, you have to do it, and I think that's where Angie and Nicholas and Karen and others, or that committee can get back together. One of the problems with that committee, if you'll recall, was that when we first did it, then we split it into two because it was so enormous. And I'm not sure that we're still too damn enormous. And maybe we need to get, now we have something to focus in on and say, okay, what are the priority areas? What are the metrics we're going to use? Analyze that, look at it, see what that's going to take in terms of time and cost, and then we have something we can act on. or we can make a recommendation on. As it is, we're just kind of waving our arms and saying we want more information. Well, we need to know what it is. So if Nicholas, if you and Angie would get together, and Karen, and start that conversation and then get back to us, we can do that. Or if you want to pull that subgroup back together, Scott, that's fine too. Okay, Doug.
I'm going back to the assumption of what Matt said, and the idea that every disparate act within a core area has a relational aspect to everything else. And I think in many cases there is none. Correct. And to try and find that or get the money to prove that is going to cost a lot of money. So I'm trying to maybe what John said is, if there's an area that we know that there are relational aspects, let's do that and maybe set a model. But to spread this over the whole state, sorry, Brian, it may be impossible.
Well, just let me step back a second and say the whole decision that the bird was not warranted was based on the approach of taking this to a range-wide scale and reviewing how we were doing and where we were going. And all I'm suggesting is that Wyoming do its share, because the other 10 states aren't there yet. So we can cry poor on it, or we can go after it the best we can and give the best report we can. I don't want us to go in accepting until we've reviewed what we can and cannot do. I'm not suggesting for certain that we can do it all, but I do think it takes real analysis and sitting down deciding what the outcome should look like, and then dissecting it as to what we actually can achieve.
And I think, as Bob said, we can, before next meeting, we can gather back together, and I know Nicholas has done a lot of this deep look at what it's gonna take. So programming time is it. Hopefully we're at a point where information is available. It's just rather than hand plugging everything in, programming to make it automated is one of the next hurdles.
Yeah. And prioritization, I think, is really a key.
Then we can prioritize.
Yeah.
And we can bring that back to the group.
And I think that
Bob, I think there's another way to look at this as well, and as equally as important. You know, we're talking about areas in some of these core areas where we may have exceeded, what we laid out as 1 per 640 and 5%. It may be worth our efforts to take a look at low impact areas where we have assumed disturbance of up to 5% and up, 1 per 640, where we're nowhere near there. That's an equally compelling story we should be telling as a state, is this is what we anticipated, this is our max level of impact for any particular core area, and we're sitting at 1% and a handful of wells over X. That's an equally compelling story. If we don't quantify that, we're going to run the risk of the blanket assumption that we're going to have disturbance of up to 5% throughout all core areas in the minds of the public and areas where we have current existing exceedances or potential exceedances based on these exceptions. So we need to balance that story now. How, I don't know.
Well, I think that comes back to what Bob was saying earlier. Industry, part of our incentive is to provide the information to Nicholas, to give him that information, because he doesn't have it.
Sure, but in cases where we're not even drilling at all, and that's part of the base assumption, there should be a different mechanism other than us proving a negative as an industry. That's a function of the state of Wyoming, in my opinion.
And at the same time, Paul, we did Daniel because it was small and concise and wasn't a lot going on. And we found 6 times the disturbance that we were concerned for. So there's a warning in here that we need to really get a look at this, and we've got to figure out how to do it. You're right. The positive side, those are the real core areas right now that we can establish.
Yeah.
We need to be able to prove it across the board.
Okay, you have something?
I was just gonna say, I just think it's really critical that we know on a range-wide, landscape scale-wide, what we have done, what our achievements we've, accomplished, and then being able to tell that story versus just site-specific, we've done this, site-specific, we've done that. So I just think this cumulative effects or cumulative information will be very useful in our movement forward.
Last thing I would say is, and I think, again, words carry incredible power. Kind of the counter to the thing that Dave and I wrestled with a couple months ago about 5,000 wells doesn't mean 5,000 pads. Site-specific doesn't mean 5 acres. A DDCT analysis area is flipping huge. So it's not like we're doing this and looking at one section at a time and saying, oh, we're okay here, and then next section, we're doing something. These analyses are big, and so don't take site-specific to mean one well pad and you're looking only at the stuff around it. It's much bigger. That's why the DDCT has the 4-mile analysis area, and then as it touches another, they're big. So it's not as fine scale as Dave's gross scale is, and that's one of our problems, is that we're talking all these conceptual, and if I go into Albertsons and try to explain this to a relatively intelligent person, they'll lose their mind and run out of the parking lot, and God knows what they'll do. So.
Bob, I just want to give you a statistic back up. I haven't run a number in a long time, but several years ago I was curious about that. The average DDCT was 50,000 acres. So that's your scale. I mean, they vary greatly, but that's on average what we're looking at.
Just 60,000 acres?
50,000 acres. I mean, I could look at all the assessment areas and update that, but that's a number that I remember.
That's a ballpark, and I think it just illustrates the point. We talk in extremes and we don't talk in realities, and that's why we have a need for this, Brian. I hear that. But I think John had a real salient point. Let's start thinking about prioritization. Let's look at where we can do it, what it's going to take, and then Beth and I at least can start looking down the road as to where we might be able to find some of the funds to get us going on it. I think we can probably start that process, but we need to have a number. We got to be able to go in and say, this is what we're shooting for, and this is our timeline. So, okay, are we good on that? Let's move into durability credits. Heather.
I'm going to stay seated. I'm tethered to my technology here, but
and there are several members. Raise your hand if you were on that subgroup, just so I know. I kind of watch for you, Jenny and Dave. Nathan's back there. Who's that? Christy?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So I should be brief. So I got tasked with leading a subgroup of a subgroup to look at the logistics of term credits. We've had that discussion, I know, in depth in Rock Springs and at past Sgit. So we convened the group last week. We got a little delayed due to a 35-day break in my attendance at work. So we met, and I think we had a really good discussion for a couple hours. We don't have any outputs yet. Bob said that would be okay. We didn't need to have something ready by this Sgit. So we discussed looking at that 30-year, which seems to be the time frame people were circling around, and what that might look like, how we could incorporate that into the mitigation framework, how that potentially would affect the debiting side or the crediting side. We just begun to dive into that conversation, and we've got a couple tasks. Some folks are looking at it outside of that discussion and trying to come up with the logistics of what that might look like. So I don't have anything major to report right now. Maybe by the next Sgit. I think we had some questions for Bob, because Bob was not in that group. You know, how opening of the EO under the new governor administration, if that's where we need to try and get these things incorporated in. There's a lot of questions I think we still have about kind of the decision space that's outside of that group. But happy to entertain questions, or other members of the group can talk about what we discussed.
Anybody else on that group want to add to that?
Just that we're continuing to have a challenge of finding out how we reach a 30-year value, and the rolling changes for short-term projects. It's not an easy walk to figure out how we make that worth anything. So it continues to be a difficult path.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, update, more to come, right?
More to come.
Okay. Scott?
All right, I'll give you a quick update as well on application for Sage Grouse farming. December 31st, we did receive an application to conduct sage grouse farming from Fiddleback Ranches, formerly of Diamond Wings, and our field staff did do a site visit in early January, compared the application that they had submitted to what the infrastructure was on the ground. Certificate of compliance was issued with several stipulations, just like last year, and the stipulations primarily revolve around the infrastructure that's needed at the facility to comply with our Chapter 60 regulation that was promulgated several years back now. And long story short, the deadline for those infrastructure improvements as last year is March 15th, 2015 of this year. And when I say infrastructure, there's a variety of some construction that needs to be finished for the incubator, the hatching building, the chick brooder barn, and all of these, whether it's new or retrofitting existing structures, revolves around sanitation and decontamination requirements as per our regulations. So more to come. March 15th is closely coming, and these infrastructure improvements must be in place prior to us issuing approval to actually go out into the field and collect eggs and start the process. So similar to last year, we're waiting for infrastructure completion and upgrades before those stipulations will come off of their certificate of compliance.
Questions? Okay. Winter concentration, Leslie.
Yeah, so the Winter Concentration Area Subcommittee, we met in December, and we talked a lot about the NPL research project. There were kind of two study designs being tossed around, one based on aerial collection, drones, forward-looking infrared, the other one based on telemetry, marking, radio coloring birds. So since then in December, I think there's been some talks, and so Paul, if you want to share where you think you're going there?
You bet, Leslie, thank you. We have settled on the telemetry study. The cost was roughly equivalent, and Matt can answer some detailed questions if we get into it. So we have an agreement in principle on the design of the study to some extent, and obviously, you know, the telemetry aspect of that. We're working through budget. We're hoping to get that settled here in the next few days and then start in earnest. I would like the subcommittee to perhaps reconvene sooner than later, Matt. I think probably a good idea for us to do a triple check on approach and how we'll move forward on that. But we are moving forward and excited to see what happens. So we're making progress finally. Good. It's good. Matt, anything to add?
No.
Good.
I would just like to say that I'm actually happy that the decision was telemetry based versus the aerial, because the aerial was such a new technology that it seemed like we would be, you know, having, like, I guess, questions and further maybe potential issues down the road with the study, because maybe the aerial issues, you know, like, oh, are they disturbing the birds? And so it was like a test upon a test. So I really like that the telemetry won out in that science.
Yeah, and that was certainly a factor, Joy. you know, that, and we just think we're gonna get better data with the, you know, the telemetry. That doesn't mean I don't want us, you know, if we have a chance to pilot some new technology, that we should take advantage of that. We've got 2 drone platforms we've deployed in the field. I wanna see what capabilities down the line we can have to inform that whole issue of using drones for aerial surveys and all that. But it'll be an additive that we'll do on our end.
Cool. Will you report on that too, as you move forward
Absolutely.
with that?
Yeah, we've already, you know, once we start testing on that front, absolutely.
That'd be great.
What else?
So, while these negotiations are happening, Game and Fish kicked in some money to get some transmitters on the ground. We are starting captures next week, depending on conditions and all that, but trying to fill that gap while Paul gets those that contract finalized. So so that's the NPL study. There is another study out there that's more a statewide approach. It's funded by the BLM, and it's working specifically with Dr. Beck and his lab. I sent a progress report from this study to the subcommittee, and it's identifying other possible winter concentration areas in the state by using previously collected telemetry data from other studies. Those other studies are not necessarily designed beforehand to collect winter areas, but that data is out there, so we might as well take a look at it, see what we can learn from it. The phase 2 of that study is also to put transmitters on birds in the red desert area. So as in areas of high, low, and possible development. So as that occurs, we'll learn more from that statewide study. I think it's important to remember that, so sage grouse don't fly to Mexico for the winter. They live in Wyoming. So sage grouse have winter range in Wyoming. The executive order also defines what a winter concentration area is. So I look at winter concentration areas as a thumb. All thumbs are fingers. So all winter concentration areas are winter range, but not all winter range is winter concentration areas. That's an important point to keep in mind as we go through this research. So those are the 2 kind of studies taking place for that.
Leslie, thank you for that, because that has been one of the things that, as we've worked through the RMP amendments, that has been particularly problematic, is people taking winter concentration and putting it where it's wintering, and wintering where it's winter concentration. And Beth and I have had a fairly lengthy go-round of trying to explain that difference for the last several months, but that's well put. I appreciate that. Yeah. Tom, go ahead.
Question for Leslie, and I guess anyone on the committee. One of the objectives of the BEC's data mining exercise was to try to determine if there were interim type management that could be gleaned from any of that data. You mentioned delineation of potential new core, but you didn't mention management. Has he decided that there is nothing to learn relative to impacts and management from those existing data sets?
No, I don't think he's to that point yet. I think that's still on the table to be looked at. I would defer to.
Yeah, and the genetic disturbance portion is the next phase, so I think that's the next step.
Okay, and that's, you talked about phase 2 being putting collars on the red desert.
Right, but they have, so there's four areas that they're looking at, so where they're collecting or that they have existing data.
Okay.
They're looking at that in relation to the surface.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to see, it's a different project, but I wonder if we got any feedback on the translocation project with Dakotas.
Yeah, the translocation project to the Dakotas, the commission did approve translocation in 2019, so we're going to be taking 20 males and 20 females. Probably half of those will have broods, half will not have broods, to the Dakotas. Still from the same area. northwest of Rollins, it will be our source. And we are also still monitoring that source population. I just talked with the researchers last week, asking about an analysis of impacts to that source population. That's contingent upon us continuing this translocation effort. We need to know what those impacts are to our source population. So they're working on that. They're I think they've hired a PhD student to work on that, or they're very close to, but that is coming. So
on the other side of the line, do we know if any of the prior population delivered has survived?
Some of them have survived. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. They're being put into North Dakota, but they're crossing the line into Montana quite a bit. There was concern about Montana hunting season that first year. One of the translocated birds got harvested. But the second year of translocations, there were 24 translocated birds in Montana available, 24 or 27 available to be harvested, and none of them were harvested. So we're working closely with North Dakota, and North Dakota is working with Montana about that.
That's another thing to be applauded in an annual report, is a cooperation with others where they're nearly extirpated, Wyoming contributed to attempting at least to return it to the wild.
Okay, anything else on that? Yeah.
Quick question, would you refresh me on the absolute goal of this committee? Is it to define areas? And I'm kind of going back to the question about management areas. What was this committee originally set up for?
It was to try and identify what the stressors were on birds in the winter concentration area that we have. And the subset of that Beck was working on was to look at data from collared birds and to see if there were patterns or anything we could learn from what those birds did, where you just had a data set that was there that showed it. I don't know that those are even going to be the same thing. We have one winter concentration area that's been identified and delineated. What we really don't know is what causes those birds, what might cause them not to use that area, why. I think there's a whole lot of unknowns, but as this one in particular is related to industrial development, is it people that would cause them to avoid? Is it disturbance? We don't know. And is that a fair?
Absolutely. I think we've got an opportunity to refine the delineation of winter concentration areas, perhaps, given the one identified in NPO is huge. Based on acreage alone, that is not a winter concentration area. So I think that's part of what we certainly want the study to do. The bulk of the study is to determine, great, we've got a winter concentration area, so what? What are the thresholds from a surface disturbance standpoint and human activity standpoint that may tip the scales and clearly move them off those winter concentration areas? We want to avoid that. And that's what I'm hoping to get out of the study is what's my development scenario going to look like to make sure we protect it.
And what are those management prescriptions?
Exactly. Well, exactly. Yeah. Putting those thresholds into policy.
I guess my concern is what you clearly stated. There are winter concentration areas, and then there's wintering birds. You start mixing those, you're going to have a regulational management nightmare.
And
that's what I'm hoping part of this committee does say. For these specific things, these may be appropriate, but it doesn't fit everywhere.
As of now, there is one winter concentration area identified on the planet. That's what we're looking at. And if there are indications that there may be a similar phenomena occurring in other areas, but it hasn't been documented. I think knowing what we can gather from the one we are aware of is going to help us to be able, if those other areas do exist to identify them as well. But, you know, that's the harsh truth, is that there's one.
I guess my sensitivity is to this is similar to the migration routes. Now if 7 sage grouse go under a fence, we have a migration route that needs to be protected. And so that's how a well-meaning one case ends up being everywhere. And so
well, this isn't 7 chickens. This is fairly well defined. Do you want to?
Yeah, to help, I mean, the executive order itself outlines, there's a definition of a winter concentration area. It has to be identified and validated through RSF techniques. It does not do what you just described.
Well,
so that won't happen. But to go back to the original language, and I have the notes and I have the recordings, need to make it clear that designation of habitats is an agency responsibility. How those are managed is the role of this group, not drawing the lines of where grouse use, and that's a biological thing. That was, in terms of winter, the process for doing that was prescribed by this group, but actually doing it is an agency role. But what to do with those is policy stuff is yours, not the agency's.
Okay, anything else? Winter concentration. All right, we'll quickly go around if anybody's got reports from their agency that have not been covered. Russ, you good?
Well, I mean, somewhat sage grouse related is we are kicking off a grassland plan amendment, mostly focused on prairie dogs and wildlife management. But it overlaps sage grouse core area, and so we're threading the needle there and expect to hear more soon.
Right?
The only thing for me is, I guess, just before the holidays, the Farm Bill was passed. We're slowly getting details on what that's going to look like, but it doesn't appear much change to that as far as, I guess, things this group would be concerned with. Our Working Lands for Wildlife program, which Sage Grouse Initiative falls under, will be continued. Overall, there's an increase in conservation funding in the Farm Bill. How that'll get drilled down to Wyoming, we're not sure yet, but I guess maybe to read the tea leaves, you'd think that'd be an overall increase in funding. On the general equip side of things, there is an increase in funding for wildlife. So again, I think we have additional dollars for those types of projects. Regional Conservation Partnership Program, that program also will continue into the future, where partners can put proposals in for basically landscape scale conservation. And looks to be some changes in our easement programs, but I think not much change there. So. And
on the easement side, the changes are positive.
Yeah, I think so. It could bring some more competition to the table, which could or couldn't be good, I guess, depending on how your opinion is of that. But yeah,
it removed a lot of the barriers that were in there. That's the part that's positive. It's going to be more user friendly than what it was, the ALE. So.
Yeah. And I think it's the same with our CPP. Hopefully it took care of some of the administrative burden and things like that. So we'll see.
Okay. Joe?
Yep.
Susan? Heather?
Briefly, the Conservation Efforts Database, the CED, was affected by the shutdown, the furlough. There are going to be recorded webinars available online starting some of them are already available. There'll be one on batch uploading available next week. We're not quite sure how the timeline will be adjusted yet. Lee said he's going to work with the states to figure out how the shutdown may have affected data entry. For those of you not familiar, if you want to check out the CED, it's at conservationefforts.org. That's going to be the main source collecting conservation efforts across sagebrush for the 2020 assessment that WAFL is conducting. And then just real quick, I did a report on where we were sitting on Pathfinder Sweetwater, how many credits have been sold to date, and we're sitting at 1,032 out of over 100,000 credits available.
Scott? Nothing. Joe?
Yeah. It's something that came back to my feeble mind. I think some is being from a county that has 2 incorporated municipalities inside a core. I think we have to remember not all habitat inside a core is suitable habitat. are all, and that's something I think we always have to keep in mind as we move forward. We get on this, that it's landscape, but, you know, town of Saratoga and the town of Hannah, you know, I think we need to keep that in mind. By not Swiss cheesing, we did take in a lot of land in an area that is not suitable for sage grouse. And that's something we gotta remember as we move forward through this exceptions and modifications and waivers process, that, you know, we may be able to be sighting and not hurting the bird at all when we're in some of these areas.
And it's true, the county has adopted where trout dance on Main Street for Saratoga and where chicken strut on Main Street for Hannah. Is that how you guys?
I don't think Hannah's taking that as their deal. You know, you might go to the Nugget, maybe for Bruce, he might have a different opinion on this, but, you know, I think that's just something we always need to keep in mind. You know,
I just figured that was probably a pretty hot topic for the commissioners over there.
You know, when we discuss this and when we talk with people, we gotta remember that.
Yeah.
Not necessarily something happening inside a core harm the bird in one bit. You know, when the wolf has a party, you know, it didn't harm the bird one bit.
Okay. BLMs. You good? No, we're good. Okay. Beth?
I think mostly everybody recognizes me from the last meeting, but I'd just say it's nice to be here. Governor Gordon's office has designated me as the Sgit representative for the time being. So if you have any questions on the planning stuff, I think you've gathered, you can come to me for that. So. Only 14 more days of legislature. Not counting.
So Bob, if I could, I'd ask Leslie to give us a quick update on, you know, annually we do our wing bee in November to analyze the past season's sage grouse harvest in terms of what that means for productivity going back to the earlier summer. So if you would, Leslie, could you give us a quick rundown?
Yep, so last fall, hunters voluntarily turned in 737 chick wings, 891 hen wings, for a ratio of 0.83 chicks per hen, which is lower than what you need for a stable population. A stable population needs about 1.2 chicks per hen. Increasing needs about 1.5-ish. So we're at 0.83. So we are in the downswing of the population cycle for sage grouse. We had similar results last year. So we're definitely in the downswing, and this is similar to what other states in the West are seeing.
Anything else? No. I just have a couple things. The budget is nearing completion according to both the House and Senate. The good news is that means there's $5 million more goes to the trust for into the trust, which will generate money for projects. But the other part of that is that we got an additional 1.7 million, 500,000 went to state lands for invasive species management, primarily retreatment, and 1.2 million went into the trust, which will work with the governor's office on the initiative that he outlined in his State of the State to address primarily invasive grasses, but it also includes other species that we're looking at. So there will be more to come on that, and that's a pretty big issue for some of our core areas for sage grouse. So we did do fairly well as far as funding for some of the things that are important to folks in this room. With that, public comment. Anybody have any comment that they would like to make, issues you want to raise, and that includes those of you at the table, or agenda items for the next meeting. Anybody?
I appreciated the workshop this morning. So good Q&A discussion.
Good. I think we'll probably do more of that. What we're finding is that those of us who deal with this every day sometimes don't convey that information as well as we probably should, and that was highlighted a little bit even in some of the conversation here today, that it isn't necessarily transparency, it's just pushing that information out in a more aggressive fashion Angie and I have had those conversations. I think that's very positive, but, and maybe go a little deeper than trying to do it in the context of a Sgit meeting in a 30-minute block or something. So appreciate that, Doug. Anybody else? Yeah.
I just put another challenge on the table for us. As you know, I work in a bunch of the other states as well. And one of my concerns that we're trying to deal with, and I think off to a very bad start, is the feral horse and burro problem. And I'm wondering if we have any way of estimating its impacts, particular to sage grouse in this state. If we have any reporting that would be useful. Joe and Doug and I have talked about this a bunch over the years, but we're gonna have to eventually get to a point where we can give stats. So I just don't know of anything out there right now that helps us with that.
So the legislature about 4 years ago kind of looked at it. The best stuff that we could find them was information on horse and burrow impacts to shrubs and dietary selection, things like that, that you would have to somehow then correlate to sage grouse habitat, which is a bigger lift than it sounds like. So there's not much out there.
Well, it may be that we can get a little bit of direction in that regard with the current research that's being done in Sweetwater County, where they are looking at dietary overlap and habitat use, and horses are included in that. That's not the purpose of it, but I think that when we get a handle, and what are we thinking, Scott, 2 years before we really have any tangible results on that. But it's looking at elk, deer, livestock, and horses, all of those components and how they're using that habitat, primarily south of Rock Springs. So that may be helpful to maybe point that direction.
I think, especially if we can address it early with the folks doing the work that they were trying to get there. You know,
they are aware of that.
Okay, because, I mean, it's a deciding factor in Nevada. I mean, they're not gonna have sagebrush thanks to horses. So it affects us.
And they're well aware of that. So.
The only other thing that is out there is Department of Ag did some flights a couple of years ago in kind of the Jefferson City area that were infrared flights looking at horses, and that was based mostly on trying to get an actual count versus some of the counting methods that are used. But it showed kind of where they use stuff in different seasons. But again, that doesn't, there's no real nexus.
Direct correlation is not easy.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody else? Thank you all. Thanks to those of you who, we got one.
Well, I was just, since Sherry's not here, I was just, I think she's either a co-author or their company was heavily involved relative to this, the new information for the new EO. There are at least 2 major papers out on power line, back to sage grouse.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, Utah State just came out with one, and I'm still looking at it, but yeah, it's come out with some pretty similar information, but if you haven't seen it, we could provide it for them.
We actually, Karen did forward those to everybody, and it should, is it on the website too? Probably a link or whatever might not be a bad idea so that people can access it.
There's that, and then there's a new monograph out to that, I believe.
Can you share that with Karen?
I'll ask for it, I don't have it yet.
Okay, great. All right, thank you all.